What would you do if, in the middle of a blizzard so fierce it swallowed sound, 3 ghost-like creatures appeared at your doorstep shivering, silent, and alone? Not a soul behind them. No mother in sight. Just the snow, the wind, and the question, why your house? Why tonight? Whispers in the snow. If you're listening to this story right now, drop a comment and tell us where in the world are you tuning in from. It was the kind of winter night that made even the strongest men feel small. The storm had been howling for hours, hammering the old wooden cabin tucked deep in the Wyoming mountains. Inside, Henry Whitaker sat alone by the fire, the crackling logs his only company, until a sound unlike any other broke through the wind. A faint scratching, a desperate whisper. The wind screamed through the pines like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters of an old cabin perched near the foot of the Absaroka Range in northern Wyoming. Snow fell in blinding sheets, sweeping across the hills and piling knee-deep against the door. It was January cruel, bitter, unrelenting. At 71, Henry Whitaker had lived through dozens of Wyoming winters, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the temperature, which had dropped to a brutal 39 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the silence beneath the storm, a silence that pressed against the windows and seeped into the cracks of the house like a ghost looking for warmth. Henry was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair that curled just slightly at the ends. His face was weathered, not just from the sun and wind, but from grief that had settled into his bones. A former hunting guide, he'd once led wealthy clients into the backwoods for elk and bear. Now, he kept mostly to himself, his nearest neighbor nearly 4 miles away. His wife, Carol, had passed 8 years ago, taken swiftly by cancer. Their only son, David, a wildlife photographer, had died in a snowmobiling accident just 3 winters later. Since then, Henry's life had shrunk to the size of his cabin, his daily routine dictated by firewood, canned food, and the radio that kept him connected to a world he no longer fully trusted. That night, Henry was dozing in a worn leather armchair, a blanket over his lap, and an untouched cup of coffee cooling on the end table. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting a soft orange glow on the wooden floor. The storm had knocked out the electricity hours earlier, leaving only the fire and a few lanterns for light. He might have slept through the night, might have let the storm pass unnoticed, if not for the faintest sound. It came again, a scratching, then a pause, then another. Henry stirred. The wind often dragged branches across the roof or sent loose shingles flapping, but this sound was different, rhythmic, timid. Not the wind's language, but something else entirely. He stood slowly, joints cracking in protest, and moved toward the front door. He paused, one hand on the knob, the other reaching for the heavy flashlight he kept by the entryway. When he opened the door, the cold hit him like a wall, slapping the breath from his lungs. The wind screamed through the crack, dragging snow into the foyer. And there, just beneath the overhang of the porch, huddled 3 small creature shadows in the white, barely distinguishable from the storm-blown snowdrifts. They didn't move at first, as if frozen in place by fear or exhaustion. Then one of them lifted its head, revealing wide amber eyes and tufted ears. A bobcat kitten, no more than a few months old. Henry's heart thudded. He stepped back, uncertain. Bobcats were wild, elusive predators, not house cats. But these? They were no threat. Their fur was matted with ice, their tiny bodies shaking violently. One of them, the smallest, collapsed onto its side, its legs twitching weakly. The other 2 pressed themselves against it, trying to warm their sibling, their breath visible in the frigid air. Henry had seen plenty of wild things in his life. He'd put down a mountain lion once that had stalked too close to a schoolyard, but nothing he'd ever hunted, tracked, or photographed had looked so pitiful, so heartbreakingly small as these 3 kittens. "What in God's name?" he muttered, barely recognizing his own voice. The logical part of his brain said to shut the door, to let nature take its course. But another part a quieter, deeper place inside him, the part that still mourned Carol and David, refused to look away. He stared at the kittens for what felt like a long time before finally dropping to one knee. "It's okay," he said softly, though he knew they couldn't understand him. They didn't move, didn't flee, didn't growl, just trembled. Henry reached out, scooping up the smallest one. It weighed almost nothing. Its paws were stiff, and its breathing shallow. He stood and carried it inside, setting it gently onto the blanket he'd just vacated. The other two stared, frozen in place. He returned to the door, holding it open longer than was comfortable. "Well, come on then." To his amazement, the remaining kittens moved. One hesitated at the threshold, then stepped over it. The last followed, its movements awkward, uncertain. Henry closed the door behind them, shutting out the scream of the storm. Inside, the air was still and warm, filled with the soft crackle of firewood. The kittens clustered together again near the hearth, their breathing already easing. Henry tossed another log onto the flames, watching as the smallest one curled into the others, like a final puzzle piece locking into place. He didn't know where their mother was. Dead, perhaps. Taken by the storm or a hungrier predator. All he knew was that for some reason, they'd come here to his doorstep, and he'd let them in. Henry leaned back against the door and slid to the floor. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The storm howled outside like a wounded beast. Snow continued to slam against the windows of Henry's cabin, blanketing the landscape in a whiteness so dense, the world beyond the glass might as well have vanished. Inside, the fire cracked louder than before, licking hungrily at the fresh logs Henry had stacked with trembling hands. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that even the softest noise might shatter the fragile stillness settling over the room. The smallest kitten lay curled on the old patchwork blanket, its body barely stirring. The other two, slightly larger, but still far too young to survive on their own, lay huddled close, pressing against each other and the warmth of the stone hearth. But the littlest one, the one that had collapsed in the snow, looked different. Its ears were drooping, its whiskers frozen stiff. There was no visible breath rising from its mouth. Henry knelt down, his knees cracking in protest. "Come on now, stay with me," he whispered. The tone in his voice surprised him. He hadn't spoken to anything with tenderness in years, not since Carol's final morning. Carefully, he lifted the kitten and wrapped it in a clean towel. It didn't resist. Its body hung limp in his large, weathered hands. Henry drew it close, pressing the tiny creature against his chest where the wool of his flannel shirt was still warm. He sat back in the armchair, his fingers trembling slightly as they rubbed circles into the towel. "You're not going to die here, not tonight," he murmured. The firelight cast soft shadows across his face, lines of sorrow etched deep into his skin. Minutes passed. The storm raged. Henry waited. Then, so faint it might have been imagined, a small breath escaped the kitten's mouth. It was weak, like the last flicker of a candle, but it was there. Henry closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. Another followed. Then a third. The towel beneath his hands began to shift ever so slightly as the kitten's limbs twitched with the slow return of life. And just like that, something cracked open in Henry, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He didn't cry often, not after the funerals, not after packing up David's gear or sleeping alone for 8 years. But now, as the kitten pressed against his chest and let out a feeble mewl, he wept, silently at first, then harder. Tears slid down the deep furrows of his cheeks, unbidden but unstoppable. And it wasn't just for the kitten, it was for everything. For the family he lost. For the years he spent surviving instead of living. For the weight of silence that had clung to this house like frost on glass. "I guess you came here to save me too," he whispered into the kitten's ear. Later, when the storm calmed just enough to see shapes in the white outside, Henry set about making a proper place for the kittens. He cleared a space near the fireplace, laid down 2 layers of flannel sheets, and brought out an old cardboard box from the pantry. Inside, he layered fleece throws and hand towels, forming a soft nest. The other 2 kittens, now alert and watching, meowed softly when he gently lifted them into the box. They snuggled together instantly, adjusting to their new den without complaint. As he watched them settle, he felt the need to name them not just for convenience, but as a gesture of belonging. He picked up the smallest one, still nestled in the towel, and held it beneath the warm light of the oil lamp. Its fur was a soft mixture of tawny gold and smoky gray, with tiny black stripes on its legs. "You're Ash," he said softly. "Strong in the storm." He glanced at the other 2. One had wider eyes and more prominent tufts on its ears. It blinked back at him, unafraid. "You'll be Willow," he said. "Gentle, but you bend with the wind." The last one was the boldest, already pawing at the side of the box, testing its boundaries. Its coat had a reddish hue that caught the firelight like autumn leaves. "Birch," Henry declared, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Stubborn, like your namesake." He sat back again and let the names settle in the room. Ash, Willow, Birch, the trees Carol had loved. They used to walk together through the aspen groves in fall, her gloved hand tucked into the crook of his arm, her voice always pointing out which trees were which. She would have loved these kittens. She would have known exactly what to do. "Carol would have told me I was crazy," Henry chuckled under his breath. "But then she'd sneak them scraps from the table and pretend she didn't." He stayed up late that night, tending to the fire and checking on the kittens every 15 minutes. Ash began to stir more, and by midnight was lifting its head and opening its eyes. When Henry offered a shallow saucer of goat's milk warmed on the stove, Willow and Birch lapped it up eagerly. Ash only managed a few drops, but even that was a victory. The storm battered the cabin through the dark hours, but inside, the air felt different, now warmer, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It breathed. The morning light came reluctantly, pushing through thick layers of snow cloud like a tired candle behind a curtain. The storm had not passed, only softened. Flakes continued to fall, slow and steady, blanketing the vast hills of northern Wyoming in a hush so deep it swallowed every sound. Henry Whitaker stood at the window with a mug of lukewarm coffee, watching the world beyond his porch disappear inch by inch beneath white. The thermometer outside read 22 degrees 4. The wind had quieted, but the cold remained unforgiving. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace spread like honey across the wooden floor. The small cardboard box near the hearth had been upgraded. Henry had spent the better part of the early morning reinforcing it with an old wooden crate, padding the inside with straw he kept in the shed, and thick layers of fleece. The kittens Ash, Willow, and Birch slept curled together in a tangle of ears and tails, their small bodies rising and falling in gentle rhythm. They had survived the night. That alone felt like a miracle. Henry, still in his flannel shirt and wool pants, sat back down in his armchair, placing the coffee on the side table. He looked at them for a long moment, a faint smile settling across his face. "You 3 are full of surprises," he muttered. It had been years since anyone had shared his space, not since Carol passed. He had visitors now and then, folks from town, mostly younger people like Ben Travis, the mail carrier, who was polite but always in a hurry. Henry didn't mind. Solitude had become a coat he wore well. Or so he thought, but now, the sound of soft paws padding across the floor, the gentle mules at feeding time, and even the curious looks from Birch when Henry spoke aloud, they were all subtle cracks in his carefully constructed silence. He poured some warm goat's milk into a shallow dish and set it near the crate. Willow was the first to stir, ears twitching, nose twitching more. She padded out carefully, followed by Birch, who immediately batted at the corner of the blanket with a mischievous swipe. Ash, ever the smallest, moved more slowly, but her eyes were clearer today, no longer dull with exhaustion, but alert, steady. Henry watched them feed, then reached for his book-worn copy of A River Runs Through It. The spine softened from rereads, but he didn't open it. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on knees, and spoke softly into the warm air, his voice barely above the sound of the fire. "My boy David used to love mornings like this," he said, not really expecting anyone or anything to respond. "Said snow made the world new. Said it made the silence feel alive." The kittens continued to lap at the milk, ears flicking occasionally in his direction. "It was enough," Henry continued. "He was always running ahead of me on the trail, even when he was little. Wouldn't wait. Carol used to scold him, but he had that explorer's heart. You could never tie it down." He let the words hang for a moment before picking up a faded photograph from the side table. It showed a young man in his early 20s, camera slung around his neck, standing in front of a frozen lake, grinning. His hair was thick and windblown, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. David had his mother's eyes and Henry's jaw, a blend of laughter and determination. Henry stared at it a long time. "He died 4 winters ago," he said finally. "Broke through the ice on Brooks Lake. He was chasing a shot of a moose crossing. Camera survived. He didn't." The fire crackled. "I never told Carol that last part," he added quietly. "She wouldn't have blamed him, but it would have broken her heart to know he died chasing beauty." Ash wandered toward him then, slow but steady. She paused a foot away, staring up with wide amber eyes. Henry held out a hand, palm open. To his amazement, she stepped forward and nuzzled against his wrist, just once then returned to the others. He chuckled softly. "You're all heart, little one." As the morning passed into afternoon, Henry continued to tend to his unexpected guests. He rearranged their bedding, added another towel to the edge of the crate, and even laid down a rug for them to explore. They didn't scratch the furniture. They didn't try to escape. It was as if they understood, on some primitive level, that this man, this space, meant safety. At one point, as Henry sat beside the fire, Birch climbed out of the crate and wandered over. With a quick leap, he jumped onto the hem of Henry's coat, grabbed it in his teeth, and gave it a playful tug. Henry burst into laughter, a real laugh, full and warm, the kind that hadn't touched his throat in years. "Well now," he said, pulling gently at the coat. "You've got some spirit in you, huh?" Birch responded by tugging harder, then tumbling backward with a thud. Unharmed, he scrambled upright and darted back into the crate. Henry shook his head, grinning like a man watching his grandkids cause trouble. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The landscape beyond the window had turned into an untouched painting gray skies, white hills, and trees wrapped in ice like crystal sculptures. But inside, the world had changed. Henry didn't feel quite so invisible anymore. The wind had quieted. The storm that once raged like an angry god over the hills of northern Wyoming had finally spent its fury. For the first time in over a week, the sun cracked through the thick cloud cover, spilling pale golden light across the frozen landscape. Snowdrifts glittered like powdered diamonds, and the trees wore coats of frost that shimmered in the morning glow. The world, at least for now, held its breath in peace. Inside the cabin, warmth lingered like a soft exhale. The fire, tended meticulously by Henry every few hours, now burned with a slow, steady flame. The crate had been pushed back a little from the hearth hash, willow, and birch, no longer needed to huddle in the same corner. They'd grown stronger, their bodies filled out, their coats fluffed and clean. Ash, the once frail kitten, had grown the most. Her legs were longer, her gait more assured. There was something in her eyes, now a quiet intelligence, a subtle awareness that often left Henry watching her with a kind of reverent awe. The week had brought small routines back into Henry's life. He'd begun chopping firewood again, not just for necessity, but for the rhythm of it. He prepared meals for himself and a separate dish of warmed milk and soft meat for the bobcats. He even found himself humming, sometimes talking aloud to the trio like they were old friends rather than half-wild creatures who'd wandered into his life. It was a strange feeling, this kind of comfort. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed it. Birch was the explorer. Curious and bold, he'd taken to darting across the living room, pouncing on dust motes and occasionally skidding into the table legs. Willow was gentler still, calm, with a way of watching everything that reminded Henry of Carol when she used to sit on the porch, sketching trees in silence. And Ash was a leader. Not by force, but by presence. The other two followed her, mimicked her. When she approached Henry, they did too. When she curled on the rug near the fire, they followed suit. It was a Tuesday evening, clear skies, no wind, the kind of cold that made the world seem still and sacred. Henry had finished supper and was settling into his chair when he noticed Ash standing by the door. Not pacing, not curious, standing, still. He narrowed his eyes. "What is it, girl?" Ash looked back at him, then to the door again. She let out a low, guttural growl, not hostile, not scared, alert. Henry stood slowly, his knees aching with the motion. He walked to the door, glanced through the frosted window pane. Nothing but trees and snow. Still, he opened it. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and dry like cut glass. Ash moved beside him, just one paw over the threshold, then froze. Henry followed her gaze. There, beneath the silver moonlight and inches of fresh powder, was a trail faint, deliberate paw prints, larger than the kitten's, much larger. Leading from the edge of the tree line toward the cabin, then looping back again, disappearing into the woods beyond. Henry stepped onto the porch, holding his breath. The prints were unmistakable. A full-grown bobcat, possibly the mother. "She was here," he whispered. "She came looking for them." He felt a tightness in his chest, a constriction he hadn't expected. The idea of the kittens leaving, returning to the wild, to their rightful world, should have filled him with peace. It meant they'd survived. It meant their mother was alive. But instead, his chest ached with something deeper, the stirrings of loss, long before the goodbye. He turned to Ash. "Is she yours?" Ash didn't answer, of course, but she didn't step outside either. She sniffed the air, then looked up at him with eyes that no longer seemed childish. Henry saw in them something he hadn't been prepared for: conflict, as if the pull of instinct and the comfort of fire were at war inside her. He stood beside her in silence, the snow gently falling again, light and slow. After a minute, she stepped inside. Henry closed the door, heart heavy. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old cabin made him sit up. Every gust of wind sent his ears straining for sound. He stared at the ceiling, remembering David's face, remembering the quiet evenings with Carol by the fireplace, remembering what it felt like to lose, again and again, until he stopped letting anything in. But the bobcats had changed that. He sat by the fire till dawn, watching the kittens sleep. Ash occasionally stirred, her ears twitching at sounds only she could hear. Henry knew what was coming. The moment wasn't far. And when it arrived, he would have to do what love always demanded: let go, even when the heart resisted. Morning arrived in soft gold, stretching long fingers of light through the pine trees surrounding Henry's cabin. The snow sparkled like crushed glass, and for the first time in days, birdsong broke through the silence attentive, questioning, like the forest itself was testing the return of life. The storm had passed. Not just outside, but in Henry too. The cabin was quiet. Henry had already stoked the fire, swept the floor, and filled the water basin. The kittens know the bobcats were restless. It wasn't the usual kind of energy. Birch wasn't chasing shadows, and Willow wasn't lounging in her favorite patch of sun near the window. Ash stood near the door, her posture straight and alert, tail low and still. Henry watched them, a strange tension in his chest. They had sensed something. He didn't need them to speak. He could feel it too. He walked to the window, pulled aside the old curtain. The snow outside was untouched, except for a fresh trail of paw prints coming from the edge of the forest. And there, standing at the tree line like a statue of the wild, was a full-grown bobcat. She was beautiful, sleek, muscular, with fur like burnished gold and silver, spotted subtly across her flank. Her ears twitched, and her yellow eyes locked onto the cabin, unmoving. Not a threat, not a predator, just waiting. Henry stood in silence, his hand resting on the door frame. The moment had come. He bent down beside the crate, where Willow and Birch now paced nervously. "All right, little ones," he whispered, voice rough with restraint. "Your world's come calling." He opened the door wide, and the cold came rushing in like an old memory. Willow was the first to leap down, her slender frame darting toward the light. Birch followed close behind, his confident gait almost proud. They sprinted into the snow without hesitation, their tiny bodies bounding toward the figure in the trees. The mother bobcat did not move, but her ears perked slightly. Henry turned to Ash. She hadn't moved. She stood in the center of the cabin, staring at him, her eyes wide and unreadable. He knelt, meeting her gaze. "You can go too," he said quietly. "She's waiting." Ash blinked slowly, then took a single step toward the door, but stopped. She looked at the open world, then back at the man who had warmed her body with his own, who had named her, spoken to her, given her a place when the wild had almost taken her. Then she did something Henry hadn't expected. She padded slowly toward him and brushed her head softly against his knee. Just once. A gesture so brief, so pure, it nearly undid him. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Ash turned and walked to the door. She paused at the threshold, snow swirling gently around her paws. Then she looked back one last time. Their eyes met, hers filled with something ancient and knowing, his brimming with emotion he could no longer name. No mule, no growl. Just silence between thema language deeper than sound. Then she was gone, bounding into the snow after her siblings. The mother bobcat lowered her head gently when Ash approached, touching noses before turning. In a line, the four figures disappeared into the forest, melting into the trees like mist under sun. Henry stood at the doorway long after they had vanished. In his hands was the faded green towel, the one he'd wrapped Ash in on that first freezing night. He clutched it to his chest, eyes wet, breath steady. For the first time in years, the quiet inside the cabin didn't feel like grief. It felt like peace, like a breath released. He stepped outside into the sunlit snow. The light was dazzling, warm despite the chill. He closed his eyes, listened to the wind in the trees. And for just a moment, he imagined he could still hear the soft patter of paws against the wood floor behind him. He smiled. The cabin was empty again. But his heart was not. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from words or grand gestures, it comes in quiet moments, in the presence of something fragile and wild that trusts you without condition. Henry didn't just shelter 3 orphaned bobcat cubs, found pieces of himself in their silent company. In giving them warmth, he rediscovered his own. The lesson is simple, but powerful. When we open our hearts to the most unexpected of visitors, we may find the parts we thought were lost forever. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments or tell us about a moment when an animal changed your life. And if you haven't already, follow for more stories where compassion crosses the lines between man and the wild.